decide upon a form of government, it must be equally, if not more, capable to judge of those regulations made under it, end quote. So Republicans used liberty polls to evoke the revolution and to position themselves as its true defenders. In contrast, the Federalists, those people who support the government, who support the Washington and Adams administrations, they feared that such tactics undermined the people's expressed will and so destabilized the republic. In their eyes, a Republican society was one in which citizens voted in elections and in between deferred to their representatives the business of politics. So if unhappy with the actions of their representatives, citizens had to await recourse on the next election day. Citizens could not protest a particular administration or policy without undermining majority rule and so opposing the entire system of Republican government. One Federalist insisted, quote, "It is often said that the sovereign and all other power is seated in the people. This idea is unhappily expressed. It should be all power is derived from the people. They possess it only on the days of their elections. After this, it is the property of their rulers," end quote. Federalists believed that popular sovereignty implied an obligation for citizens to support their elected officials. As George Washington proclaimed in his farewell address, quote, "The very idea of the power and the right of all the people to establish government presupposes the duty of every individual to obey the established government," end quote. So as I mentioned, in the 1790s, Republicans revived the practice of raising liberty polls, and they used them to denounce the Federalists as an oppressive regime akin to that which they had suffered under the British. As one witness to a poll raising observed, quote, "It was said by the whole of the people that liberty polls were raised last war, and they ought to be raised now," end quote. However, the Federalists viewed these polls as an assault on majority rule by a rebellious minority, and they maintained that liberty polls constituted an illegitimate and potentially illegal form of political expression because they undermined an elected government's authority. The Berkshire Gazette reported, quote, "Liberty polls have been erected in the United States by those who are unfriendly to the federal government and are intended as beacons to invite faction, turbulence, insurrection, and rebellion in our country," end quote. So whereas Republicans refer to these symbols as liberty poles and sometimes liberty trees, Federalists denounced them as sedition poles or anarchy poles. Critically, Republicans often raised liberty poles in public spaces like the town square, which forced their critics to make a difficult choice. Either allow the pole to remain standing and imply that its message spoke for the entire community, or tear it down and risk the ire of their neighbors. Now, Federalists frequently opted for the latter option, hoping that destroying the liberty pole would strip them of their symbolic power and stop Republicans from using them as rallying points. But by tearing down the liberty poles, Federalists merely confirmed their role as redcoats in Republican eyes. The Aurora General Advertiser drew this comparison, quote, "Is our condition in such circumstances better than when we were the degraded colonists of England? The only difference is that then our tyrants were foreign. Here they are domestic," end quote. Federalist attacks on liberty polls led to violent confrontations, vicious print battles, legal fights, and electoral fallout. So for instance, in the spring of 1799, a Federalist militia unit from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, tore down 5 liberty poles in the nearby borough of Reading. When the local Republican newspaper printed a condemnatory article about their conduct, the Lancaster men broke into the paper's printing office, dragged the editor into the street, and whipped him. The Republican press in Pennsylvania spread word of the incident to turn public opinion against the Federalists for the upcoming gubernatorial election that fall, and their campaign worked. The Republican candidate won 53% of the statewide popular vote and 86% of the vote in Reading. So through liberty poll conflicts, such as this one, Republicans and Federalists put into practice the type of popular politics they envisioned for the Republic. Republicans viewed the next election as far from guaranteed, and so they could not afford to solely rely on institutional politics to protect their welfare. To Republicans, government by the people meant government accountability to the people. And when representatives did not defend their constituents' needs, citizens had a right to seek change through extra-institutional protest. Federalists, however, feared that such tactics were inappropriate in a republic. Now that Americans elected their own representatives to frame and administer the laws, they insisted that revolutionary resistance tactics had no place. Americans did not need to oppose laws of their own making. They argued that elections provided the only appropriate avenue for citizens to seek change. But the Federalist position held within it an intense irony. Federalists attacked liberty polls to shut down Republican popular politics. But in doing so, they enacted a popular politics of their own. They used crowd action to bolster the government's authority and enforce majority rule by silencing dissidents. So contrary to their own proscriptions, these actions implied a political role for citizens in between elections, one in which grassroots Federalists vigilantly defended representative government by attacking its critics. So to conclude, I've suggested that clashes over liberty polls have deep significance for how we understand partisan conflict in the early republic. Liberty polls ignited and fueled a struggle over what the American Revolution had been fought for and what it had achieved. By raising or destroying liberty polls, Republicans and Federalists both claimed to defend the Revolution's legacy against its internal enemies. So this was a struggle for the future of the Republic, of two visions for the nations that clashed violently with each other as grassroots partisans fought to enact their own ideas of government by the people. Thank you.
First of all, just to echo what everyone else has said, thank you so much to PVI and to all of you for being here and for bearing with us all day. This paper, A New Reign of Terror, Imagining Disunion in South Carolina, is a very condensed version of one of the chapters in my dissertation, which is about the political divisions in South Carolina in the 1830s during the Nullification Crisis. And just to say a really quick disclaimer before I start, thinking about this in terms of the papers that we've heard from today, unlike most of the other papers, the subjects of my research aren't trying to combat racial or gender or economic injustice, in fact, quite the opposite. Within the context of antebellum South Carolina, slavery and patriarchy are so embedded that essentially no white person is trying to combat them. And in fact, the contest that I describe, the debate isn't over whether to preserve slavery or patriarchy, but how best to preserve them, and whether the Constitution and America provide enough protection for slavery and patriarchy. But my dissertation strives to examine this world and explore the debates and divisions within it as a way to kind of get at the coming of the Civil War and the events that came after. So, quick disclaimer. All right. So on November 26th, 1832, a South Carolina state convention issued the Ordinance of Nullification, declaring two protective tariffs null and void and threatening to secede if the government tried to enforce them. The governor called for volunteers to defend the state, and 25,000 men, half the state's white military-age population, answered the call. President Andrew Jackson, for his part, vowed to preserve the Union at all costs and threatened to send 200,000 men to the state to stamp out treason and restore harmony to the country. Civil war appeared imminent, and many feared and a few hoped that the Union would not survive the crisis. During this nullification crisis, however, South Carolina was deeply divided. Nullifiers, those who supported nullifying the tariff, controlled the state government from about 1830 to 1835, and they pushed the state to the brink of civil war. But thousands of other South Carolinians, called Unionists, resisted nullification and remained staunchly loyal to the federal government. Nullifiers during these 5 years used violence and intimidation to try to cow Unionists into silence and submission. But Unionists remained defiant. When 25,000 nullifiers volunteered to fight against the federal government, about 8,000 South Carolina Unionists vowed to fight against their own neighbors to preserve the Union. Unionists warned that nullification would lead to disunion, to the destruction of the country, and to civil war, ideas that terrified antebellum Americans. The country, after all, was only a little more than 50 years old at this point, and no one really knew if it would survive. In a world largely ruled by kings and emperors, America was a fragile experiment. Americans viewed it as a symbol of humanity's capacity for freedom and self-government. And disunion represented the failure of that experiment. Unionists believed that if the Union failed, liberty would die, not only here, but throughout the world, and perhaps forever. And so, throughout the crisis, Unionists conjured images of disunion to mobilize resistance to nullification, to try to hold the country together, to preserve the social and political order. They argue that nullification would lead to civil war, social disorder, and slave rebellion. Just to back up really quickly as a bit of context, just to understand what this crisis was, in 1828, Congress passed a high protective tariff, igniting protests throughout the South. Southerners called it the Tariff of Abominations. They condemned it as unjust, oppressive, unconstitutional, claiming it benefited Northern industry while harming Southern agriculture. Southerners signed petitions, launched boycotts, wore homespun clothing, and South Carolina, as it tends to do, took this radicalism to the extreme, arguing that the state could declare the federal law null and void. And this doctrine, as I said, bitterly divided the state, and two political parties, nullifiers and unionists, rapidly mobilized. And each expressed a different vision of union, of liberty, of the future of Republican government itself. Nullifiers viewed the Union as a compact between free and sovereign independent states and valued liberty over union. As the crisis continued, their resistance became more and more militant, and many began to accept or even welcome the possibility of disunion. Unionists, however, believed that union and liberty were inseparable, that the Union was the source of America's, quote, unexampled freedom, prosperity, and greatness. As one unionist in Greenville, in the mountainous upcountry there, said, quote, God had destined America to provide an example of liberty and Christianity to the entire world. Already, he insisted, quote, the tyrants of Europe tremble on their thrones. He envisioned the Star-Spangled Banner, quote, protecting and carrying the cross across the world to liberate mankind and establish the gospel of peace in every nation on earth. So this is this belief in the Union's providential purpose was what inspired Unionists to resist nullification and to foreground the horrors of disunion. Stories of the French Revolution 40 years earlier informed their vision. France had spiraled into chaos as revolutionaries executed tens of thousands of their political enemies, and South Carolina Unionists compared nullifiers to these French radicals, who, in their words, quote, hoped to stain this state with the blood of its sons. As nullifiers steadily took control of the state, first the legislature, then the governorship, then the militia, Unionists warned that nullifiers, like the French 40 years earlier, would begin hanging their enemies from lampposts and executing them in the streets on the guillotine. As one Unionist explained, he warned that nullifiers would engulf the state in anarchy and civil war with, quote, the temples of your religion demolished, your rivers stained with kindred blood, and the chastity of your females violated in their domestic altars. In Charleston, mobs of nullifiers roamed the streets, chanting, waving flags, intimidating their enemies. Street brawls erupted across the state, and as nullifiers and Unionists attacked each other with knives, walking canes, fishing poles, even chairs, basically anything that they could use to attack each other. Many observers reported that a, quote, new reign of terror had descended on their state. And to many, it seemed as if the entire country, the entire Atlantic world really, might erupt in chaos and all law and order might be swept away. For Unionists, the Union was precious not only because it held the states together, but also because it secured their prosperity, their liberty, and the social order. And nullifiers threatened to sort of break down all of that. Describing the state's internal divisions, one Unionist noted that, quote, the most sacred ties of friendship have been dissolved. Brother arrayed against brother, the floodgates of anarchy have been thrown up, and discord stalks the land, scattering around him firebrands and death. Another writer in Greenville agreed, writing that, quote, friendship, love of country, the ties of kindred, and the feelings of religion have all withered. Nullification has substituted discord for peace, not only in the halls of legislation, but in the family circle and the very sanctuary of God. Now, of course, this being antebellum South Carolina, slavery was central to the social order that Unionists were trying to preserve. Both parties were equally committed to slavery, which they considered an inviolable constitutional right. Unionists, however, warned that nullification would weaken or even destroy the Constitution and therefore threaten slavery's survival. Civil war, in their minds, could even inspire slave rebellion. By drawing men away from their homes, a war effort might leave women and children more vulnerable to an insurrection. One observer wrote that families lived in, quote, constant fear of their own slaves, terrified that slaves would see this political crisis as an opportunity to seize their freedom and, quote, cut their throats. Even if South Carolina secured its independence, if it somehow managed to secede and defend against the federal government, Unionists warned slavery could not survive. they believed that the only way that South Carolina could survive was to ally with Great Britain, a sort of natural ally, because South Carolina traded a lot of our cotton to Great Britain. Britain, however, was on the verge of freeing its slaves in the West Indies, a decision that Unionists feared would be catastrophic, exposing the West Indies to, quote, servile war and destruction that would transform them into an archipelago of free blacks, in their words. In antebellum South Carolinians, nothing could be more terrifying. If South Carolina allied with Great Britain, Unionists warned, the kingdom would force it to emancipate its own slaves, unleashing racial warfare. And so for Unionists, the only way to protect slavery was to protect the Union. While Unionists were outnumbered in their own state, they had the support of President Andrew Jackson and men and women throughout the country. Jackson repeatedly vowed to preserve the Union at all costs and personally threatened to lead an army into the state to crush the rebellion and possibly to hang its leaders, including John C. Calhoun. Unionist leader Joe Poinsett, writing from Charleston, kept in close touch with Jackson throughout the crisis to devise a strategy in case civil war erupted. And the plan, so Unionists had a lot of strength in these upcountry districts here, along the border with North Carolina and in Charleston. And so in Poinsett's mind, low-country Unionists could all retreat toward Charleston, where the federal government had about 600 troops already, and Unionists in the rest of the upcountry could sort of flee toward these northern districts. The federal government could then blockade the state by sea and land while it raised volunteers from the other loyal states. Then, when this federal army was ready, it could send in two armies, one from Charleston and the other from North Carolina, and the two could converge on the counties here, which was kind of a hotbed of nullification, where they could crush the nullifiers' army and restore peace to the wayward state. Poinsett assured the president that, quote, the whole Union party would unite with the government forces and take upon themselves the civil government of the state. Ultimately, this proved unnecessary. Congressional compromise diffused the crisis before it led to war. Congress agreed to gradually lower the tariff over about 10 years, and South Carolina's nullifiers, abandoned by the other southern states and facing this massive Unionist resistance within South Carolina, ultimately backed down, accepted compromise, and rescinded the ordinance of nullification. The issues that underlie the crisis, however, remained unresolved and contributed to the radicalism that defined the state for the next 30 years and that culminated in secession and civil war in 1860. In 1860, South Carolina was virtually unanimous in its support for secession, and people have often projected that unity backwards, assuming that the state had always been united behind radical action. As my research shows, however, in the 1830s, the state was bitterly divided, and that these thousands of Unionists were ready to fight against their own neighbors to preserve the Union. To conclude, these men and women view themselves as defenders of the social order, of order, liberty, and slavery from the chaos of nullification. Nullifiers condemned them as submission men, saying they were too cowardly, too unmanly to defend their rights, to which Unionists embraced the label, actually. As one explained, quote, we are submission men. We submit to the Constitution of our country. We submit to the laws. We submit to the voice of a majority of the nation. Another writer agreed that Unionists would, quote, endure any government burdens rather than accept the, quote, death knell to all law, all government, all restraint. For Unionists, this is what nullification symbolized: the breakdown of social order, brothers slaughtering brothers on the battlefield, slaves murdering women and children, the Union itself destroyed. For decades, Unionists insisted, the Union had protected them in war, enriched them in peace, had secured liberty, and made possible their prosperity. It had demonstrated humanity's capacity for self-government, and provided a shining example of liberty and Christianity to the world engulfed in despotism and heresy. In their minds, nullification threatened to destroy the fabric of union and the hope of humanity, and they were willing to fight to preserve it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and I really welcome the opportunity to read these two papers. They're both fantastic and have new and exciting and very interesting topics. So I thought I would talk about both individually, but also a little bit about what links the two together. So both these papers, as I read them, are about the limits of dissent in the new and then pretty new nation. So ultimately, they touch on the permanence of the new union and how Americans sought in this new country to calibrate the proper channels of protest and what the proper levels of dissent are going to be. And what they do is both of them really highlight how fragile the Union was in the 1790s and then again in the 1830s, and how difficult it was in this new nation to figure out what was a legitimate mode of disagreement and what was not, right? Where was that line? I think both these methods of protest that Shira and Brian are talking about, are about that there's a line, and their protesters are sort of on both sides of the line. They're both both sides are arguing for legal and extra legal means of protest. So Shira's piece really highlights the extent to which the concept of the people, I'm putting that in quotes, was harnessed by both Republicans and Federalists. So both Republicans and Federalists agree on the fact that the new republic is supposed to channel the people's voice, right? That's what the revolution accomplishes. And so what were extra legal means before the revolution, during the revolution, had toppled, extra legal means had toppled the crown and the colonies, but now the powers that are in place after the revolution want to put a brake on this very powerful call to the people to throw off the shackles of an oppressive government. So what was certainly after the fact a legitimate form of protest, right, during the crisis, that led to the revolution and the remaking of the making of the United States. Now they have to figure out how do they recast the people's voice as an illegitimate means of protest. So Federalists are denouncing these polls that symbolize a critique of the party in power, and they're suggesting that the time for protest outside of the system had passed. Liberty polls represented anarchy, even if they had represented liberty 10, 15 years earlier. So both of them I have, this is sort of unfair in a paper, and history papers are sprawling, and they had to give me a very short paper, so some of my questions are totally unfair in a paper of this length, but I figure they know the answer, so I'm gonna ask. So one of the things I was wondering about with both your papers is about sort of chronology, right? So I'm wondering for Shira's paper, how much of a difference does the Constitution and the idea of a permanent government make, right? So were liberty polls used were liberty polls used in 1781 once we have the Articles of Confederation? Are they used surrounding the Constitution? Does the Constitution itself switch the meaning of them? To what extent, how do we chart this throughout the 1780s as we get to the 1790s? Also, I'm wondering about the Liberty poll as your flashpoint. As you mentioned, my first question was, what does it look like? But I want to know, I guess, a little bit more about the Liberty poll. So who puts them up? Do we know that? Are they inextricably linked to parties? Because you link them in your paper, but I wasn't sure whether they're outside of the parties as a form of protest. And I'm wondering what's different about the Liberty poll as opposed to other means of protest. So historians tend to rely on the written word, and I'm wondering if a Liberty poll captures something that transcends the written word. So was its meaning, one thing that the written word does pretty well is that it at least purports to convey a specific meaning. Mm-hmm. I don't know if the Liberty poll captures the same thing. Maybe it's really powerful because its meaning isn't particularly well understood. Does the fact that it doesn't have one set meaning, is that helpful in terms of making it a flashpoint for disagreement? Any type of protest that you might have against the current regime, right, could be sort of channeled into whatever the Liberty poll could represent. Could it be interpreted in different ways by multiple audiences? And I'm really intrigued by this act of raising the Liberty poll as you read it as this real sense of defiance. And so, in a republic where not everybody can read and write, does it capture something that this focus that we have on writing captures that you're really getting at that other historians haven't gotten at? So also, I mean, I will say particularly this was particularly sort of telling to me as a legal historian. So I'm someone who deals almost exclusively with words. And I'm often mining text for meaning and sometimes relying on gossamer distinctions of language, but I've always really been intrigued by the study of material culture because I think it's so different from what I do. And so I'm wondering, in terms of the study of material culture, and maybe you will push back and you tell me you're not a historian of material culture and I just put you in this box, but I'm wondering about, when you're studying this, what are you studying? Do we have the actual thing? I mean, is there a Liberty Pole lying in some museum that I could go visit? I'd like to know that, so I can visit it. Are you studying the thing itself? Do we have pictures of the thing? Is that what you're studying? Do we have descriptions of the thing? And in terms of how you go about studying what the Liberty Pole means, do you have to think about it as refracted through all of those lenses, right? In thinking about how it meant something to them. Just in terms of major themes that your paper picks up on, the battles about what the Liberty Pole is going to mean. These are both the arguments that they're making about the problems with Liberty Poles are so interesting because they're both inside and outside sort of the system that I'm putting in quotes. So what your paper really does is shows us that there's not a stark dividing line between what is legal, what is illegal, and who are the people who provide this moral heft for this government to exist. So I mean these people who give power to the United States government, they're wonderful in a sense, but then they can also take that government down, right? And in terms of how we figure out how to calibrate that balance in the early republic, this paper, I think, really exposes, those distinctions and has wonderful layers of irony, and I love those. So historian's touchstone. Okay, so Brian's paper also touches on similar themes in a way. It may be that I was looking for themes to bring these together. Brian's paper takes us about 35 years later, and he takes us to a period I know better. So his paper touches on a topic that I thought very little about until now, which is Unionists in South Carolina during the Nullification Crisis. But that, I have to say, is due to lack of imagination more than anything else. I do think that this is, that once I started thinking about Unionists in South Carolina, I thought, wow, what a wonderful topic. I want to know more. He looks at South Carolina Unionists during the Nullification Crisis precipitated by the so-called Tariff of Abominations in 1828. I do love that name. And his question is, why and how did this rather small or large, I'm actually curious about how we're supposed to interpret the numbers that he gives us here, resist the calls for secession, beginning in the paper, I guess, around 1830. In terms of, so one thing I want to know is where do we get the numbers from? So I take it that we were working with a number of about 8,000 Unionists, 25,000 Nullificationists, but I wasn't sure where the source of that numbers, what the source of those numbers was. And one of the big things that I was thinking about in terms of your paper is who wins this crisis, right? So nullification happened, right? In the sense, nullification happened if we believe what the South Carolina legislature says, right? So the South Carolina legislature says that the tariff is nullified. And maybe the nullificationists win the crisis because the federal government eventually pulls back on the tariff and they decide to diffuse this issue. So maybe that's a victory. But I could also make a case for the Unionists, right? So secession did not happen. And the legal idea undergirding secession and nullification was never denounced, really. I mean, it is by Jackson. That idea is still on the table post-nullification, right? They ensure that it survives. So is that a victory for the Unionists? I mean, I could imagine a scenario. So what if Jackson had actually enforced the tariff? And I love that with the help of the Army, and you get the Army in North Carolina and coming in from the coast in South Carolina. I mean, that was really fascinating, the extent to which they had an actual plan, right? It's not just oh, let's have a lot of, very highfalutin language about how this is unconstitutional, right? They've actually got a plan in place. And so what would have happened if Jackson had actually enforced this tariff, or what if we had gotten a statement from the Supreme Court that nullification was unconstitutional? Would that have prevented the Civil War? And so I'm wondering about these questions of, what does this actually reflect about who wins, and how might we sort of figure out an answer to that question? Another question I had about sort of chronology here, I was wondering about what was going on between 1828 and 1830. Right, so Brian says that 1830 is when the nullificationists captured the state legislature. And so do they have to sort of rally discussions for those 2 years? Are things more in flux for those 2 years? I'm also wondering about where it is that these battles take place. I guess this sort of goes to my question about your numbers too, right? So is the fight in electoral politics? Is it in the newspapers? Is it in the State House? Is it in the village square? I don't know if there's a village square in the middle of the state in Anderson County, but anyway, is this a grassroots political movement, and do ordinary people actually care about this? I mean, they might if there's an army coming over the border from North Carolina, but I don't know about the tariff policy that may have enraged fewer people. So I'm also wondering, and this is me wearing my legal historian hat, does what is legal and what is not legal matter that much to your actors, right? So it seems rhetorically significant to them to try to cast their actions, whether you're a unionist or a nullificationist, as I have the mantle of, right, I'm the one who's really defending the Constitution in one way or another. But what's really striking to them is that, what was really striking to me is that this seems like largely a rhetorical move in your paper, but I'm wondering to what extent that really matters, or it's sort of just a touchstone for political maneuvering. And then lastly, about your paper, I'm wondering about how much our perspective matters, right? So I feel like if I were writing a paper about the nullification crisis in the 1830s, the immediate temptation would be to make it about the Civil War, right? And so, and thinking about, read everything through that lens and refract it back from 1860. And so I'm wondering, how do you write a history, right, where you're really looking forward from 1830 rather than backwards from 1860? Legitimately, I want to know the answer to that one. So lastly, I'll just say that both these papers are really rich, and they ask us to think about the limits of dissent and the ways in which the line between legal and extra legal is very blurry. And they highlight that perhaps the more important question that we might ask ourselves is, how does this union actually hold together for as long as it did, right? Given that it looks so fragile from the 1790s and the 1830s, rather than thinking about, why is it that the Civil War eventually breaks it apart?
Thank you very much.
Sure. Yeah, well, thank you so much. What great comments and questions, and I will attempt to answer a few of them. So first on the question of chronology, no, there are no liberty poles raised in the 1780s. Particularly remarkable when we think about the ratification debates.
Yeah.
So I think, yes, the Constitution was sort of a key moment in giving liberty poles new meaning. We see liberty poles again for the first time in 1794 when the Whiskey Rebellion really heats up. And so this is sort of the first kind of armed challenge to federal authority after the Constitution is ratified, and it's really a moment where those who are resisting this new tax are evoking the revolution. So of course the liberty pole is very potent, and their argument is really at its base, I think, about representative government malfunctioning. And so this is sort of why we see the liberty pole emerge again in this moment. And then the next sort of spate of liberty poles happens in 1798 and 1799 after the Alien and Sedition laws are passed. Who puts them up? So liberty pole raisings, for the most part, are very large community events. So sometimes hundreds of people in the community will gather on the town square and raise the liberty pole, and there'll be a lot of feasting and parading and this type of thing. When people tear them down, it's very heavily militarized, so it's often militia units that will go in and tear them down. which is interesting to me in terms of particular gender, that the raising of liberty pole makes room for women to participate in a way that destroying them does not. They are linked to parties in the way that I described, although I kind of simplified it for this paper, especially in the Whiskey Rebellion. We don't really have parties as we know them in the later period, but they do become inextricably linked to parties, and once the Federalists are out of power, they raise 0 liberty poles for various reasons, but for one of which they become a Republican symbol. Liberty poles as kind of different from the written word, I think. So liberty poles, of course, are sort of a particular means of protest and of making meaning, especially, as I said, in the way that they mark space. So liberty poles could be very tall and sometimes were the tallest things in communities. So they mark the landscape very strikingly. And they, again, mark public space, and they sort of imply a lot about what a community believes, and that has various consequences, especially during the Whiskey Rebellion, when that would invite federal troops into your community. But I don't think that these things make their meaning vague, particularly because liberty poles always have some sort of written word on them. So liberty poles will say things like "No Sedition Bill." They'll say things like "No whiskey excise" and "Long live Thomas Jefferson." So the people who raise liberty poles are very intent on making their meaning clear. And indeed, liberty poles, based on them being raised in the Revolution and all these other contexts, are easily legible to both sides as sort of a protest symbol and a kind of a rallying point for those who hold these views. Material culture. So probably the best thing to do is to, if you want to see a liberty pole, is to see the monument to the New York City Liberty Pole in New York City. I have not seen what's it called, City Hall Park? Yeah. What's interesting is that the liberty poles of the 1790s are not really maintained or commemorated in any real way, for reasons that we could talk about, historical memory, in the ways in which people are more eager to remember the American Revolution, right, and the liberty pole raised in New York City, for instance, and not the ways in which the American Revolution's meanings were contested in this period. So I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, thank you again for all those questions. Those were fantastic. Just to try to answer a few of them. As far as where the numbers come from, so by the 1832 election, when there are two pretty fully formed parties that manage to sort of mobilize voters pretty consistently, about 60% of the state's voters vote for the Nullification Party and 40% vote for the Unionist Party. And then as far as those specific 25,000 versus 8,000 figures, again, the governor calls for volunteers, and he keeps lists of all the volunteers that all the volunteers from each district, and then if you tally them up, you get about 25,000. And then the Unionists have to mobilize a little more secretly because again the nullifiers are in power, but they form these kind of paramilitary union clubs or Washington clubs that again, if you tally up all the numbers, you get about 8,000. Those are really fuzzy numbers, and it's interesting that in both cases, a lot more people vote for the parties than who volunteer to potentially fight for them, which I guess makes sense. But the fact that there's an actual plan in place, I think, is really interesting as well. As far as what might have happened if they'd tried to enforce it, one of the things that I really try to show in my work, a lot of other scholars have said, well, this is all just posturing, that nobody in 1832 actually plans to secede and go to war. And what I try to show is that secession and civil war is a distinct possibility. It's very likely that some kind of confrontation could have happened, specifically if Jackson had sent troops to enforce the tariff, which he was considering doing. That might have, you can see really easily how that could lead to an escalation of tensions that would lead to war. Nullifiers were really confident that if Jackson did that, the rest of the South would rally to their cause. But what's interesting is a lot of southern states pass, the legislatures pass resolutions, town meetings pass resolutions saying that, the Union must be preserved. We will stand by it, which is distinctly unlike 1860, when it comes down to a case of the federal government coercing a state, and the South kind of lines up behind it. The key variable there, again, being slavery. In 1860-61, the South feels as though, Lincoln and the Republican Party are going to threaten the survival of slavery, and that's enough justification in their minds to secede. Whereas in 1832, the president is Andrew Jackson, who is ardently pro-slavery and himself owns slaves. Let's see. As far as where this battle takes place, whether it's kind of grassroots or top down, it takes place on all those fields. The General Assembly, Congress, newspapers, and village squares. What's really striking is this is a sort of popular movement in a lot of ways, both nullification, but also the resistance to it. Meetings that the towns organize get 500, 1,000, 2,000 guests, and even if you account for some exaggeration in those figures, it's very clear that these are drawing massive crowds in all these towns. And I've read letters by large as large a swath of population as you can. I mean, obviously the very poor, mostly illiterate, but it's really clear that everyone is kind of excited by these political passions. Even if they're not interested in the technicalities of tariff policy, people have a sense that their liberties are threatened. Nullifiers have the sense that the federal government is infringing on their right to free trade and slavery, and unionists have a sense that nullifiers are going to trample their liberties. So when they kind of boil it down to a threat on your liberty, people are much more willing to kind of get engaged and potentially volunteer to fight to defend it. And yeah, that the question of perspective and the fact that we know the Civil War is coming does make this really difficult. And I'd be lying if I said I had an easy, clear-cut answer to that. But for me, one of the things that helps is just studying Unionists to begin with. Again, by 1860, the Unionists are essentially gone. There are a handful of people in the state that are still saying, no, we shouldn't secede. But by and large, long-term, Unionists lose this argument in South Carolina. Nullifiers do win long-term. The state does end up seceding in 1860. But I think taking Unionist resistance in the 1830s seriously, trying to figure out who these men and women were and why they resisted nullification so fiercely, why they thought the Union was so worth preserving, I think is a key to try to get at avoiding that more kind of presentist avoiding that mentality of like 1860 looking back. Trying to sort of take into account the contingency and uncertainty and the fact that people don't know what's going to happen. Scholar Lacey Ford has this great line that South Carolina nullified the tariff looking back toward the Revolution. In other words, thinking about they thought they were fulfilling the legacy of the Revolution rather than looking forward to the Civil War. And I think that's a real kind of key to understanding this. Unionists and nullifiers are both kind of contesting the legacy of the founding generation more than they are kind of looking forward to 1860 and a potential conflict in that regard. So, yeah, thank you.
I have a question, I guess for both of you. First thing I thought about after hearing both presentations, a couple of different things. One, what does it mean to be an American, right? But also, I think Shakespeare said his past prologue. So I'm thinking about what might be some modern day forms of liberty poles, right? And what are the implications when we think about power, violence, and inequality?
Yeah.
And what I'm thinking of, when we first moved here, my son and I were driving around, we were fascinated by the monuments. My son is a ninth grader, but he's a pretty deep thinker. And he looked at the one, what is it? Is it Ridge in Maine?
Yeah, the Lewis and Clark Sacagaweas, Crouching.
Yeah.
Yeah. He was trying to, is that lining up with history? Right? So those are some of the questions I'm thinking about, because I think even though you guys are kind of looking back, there's some really, really strong connections where we are right now and kind of moving forward.
Right. Well, first let me say I'm the wrong person to ask what it means to be American, as I am Canadian.
Gives you an outsider's perspective. It's great.
But no, what a great question. I think, well, first of all, like on the question of monuments and sort of where we began today, I think what Liberty Bowls kind of show us is that the ways that we mark space are important, and they imply a sort of unanimity of ideas and values from a community that are never the case, right? And that's why I think we can see people from the beginning of the United States up to now, turning to violence over a monument, right? But I think where I kind of see the most relevance of my project with some of sort of the issues of today, and especially about power and inequality and violence, is about protest more than it is about monuments or marking space. That we see kind of that ideas or concepts like the First Amendment or free speech or popular sovereignty or representative government, we like to think that those were unanimous, that they had consensual meanings when they were first sort of created in our quote-unquote founding documents, or your founding documents. But they didn't, right? People fought about them from the very beginning, so it only makes sense that we would continue to think about them today, and we would continue to question if there is a right to protest, who has a right to protest, in what venue they have a right to protest, in what ways can citizens express dissent, do citizens have a political role beyond elections? These are all still open to debate, which again, I think makes sense when we look at the early history of it.
I can't top that, so retweet. No, I mean, I agree with that completely. And it is interesting how in modern day political debates, issues of nullification do kind of crop up in interesting ways. But what's interesting is, as Shira said, these ideas were, the ideas of, what the Constitution and the Declaration mean, were highly contested then just as they are now. One of the instances that's really great is, so for precedent, nullifiers looked to Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who in the 1790s had written these resolutions that seemed to suggest that the states could declare federal laws unconstitutional. And nullifiers said, well, look, great, this is exactly what we're arguing. And then James Madison, who was still alive, writes a letter saying, no, nullification is not constitutional. What are you guys doing? And nullifiers said, well, he doesn't know what he's talking about. So, these ideas were still being contested back then. And I mean, again, the question of what it means to be American, I mean, there is no simple answer. And I, personally, I'm really glad that in some ways we have moved past the debates that were going on in the 1830s, where the debate isn't over whether white supremacy, or the debate isn't, so nowadays, the debate we're having in society is much more about, how do we, preserve civility and how do we combat white supremacy and these kind of issues, whereas the debates they were having back there were how best to preserve white supremacy, because everyone just takes it for granted. And so obviously, we as a society still have a long, long way to go, but as an eternal optimist, I think it's encouraging to look at the progress that we have made, that, there are, we have kind of moved past some of the paradigms that we were kind of caught in the 1830s, for example.
So I had actually a very similar question as Brian, but the perspective is a little bit different than Europeanist. So for Shira, my question was actually not how do these posts relate to the present, although that's important, but how do they relate to the past? Where do these people get the idea from? Mm-hmm. And in Central Europe, you have this tradition of maypoles, right? Yeah. Where it's this pagan Christian ritual. Around now, actually, they still do that, right? Yeah. Is that where it comes from? This would be a clear politicization of something that is a community event, actually, basically. So that would be like, how do we explain this? Mm-hmm. When does that happen, right? Mm-hmm. And how does it happen? And then the other question is kind of very much related to your question, but in a different way. For me, when I see both of you speaking and wondering what this is about, is, for me, it's who's got the power, right? Who's got the power? And as a Europeanist, I'm wondering, how can we talk about this without talking about the state? And how the state manifests. I mean, in the kind of European tradition, right, with Max Weber and others, the state only exists when it can monopolize power, right? Even for Weber, for example, in the German language, the German word for violence and power is the same. It's Gewalt, right? So in kind of state power, that's Staatsgewalt, right? So it's the word for violence, actually, also. So it's kind of really would kind of bringing the state back in. Yeah. And we talked at various phases also about police and policing, right? That connects to dissent and protest and where are the limits, but it's not the same perspective exactly, right? You look at it from below, look at it from on top. Does that change anything? Does it make sense? In the European context, we would talk more about the state. We would talk more about government. And all this kind of, but I was just kind of as a European is bringing that back in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that would be a question for both of you.
Sure. So first, with regard to maypoles, so there are kind of like a few, I guess we could say, precedents or kind of origins for liberty poles, but maypoles are definitely one of them. I don't think, though, that they were apolitical when they got to America. So maypoles, as you say, part of like community celebrations, but they are raised, I believe, in 17th century France when peasants kind of rebelled against their landlords. And they are also raised during the English Civil Wars by royalists. So they do have kind of political connotations, or we can see sort of the beginnings of it. They're also draw on kind of iconography that dates back to ancient Rome, where kind of we see liberty as the goddess of liberty holding a wooden pole with a liberty cap on top. So there's ways in which, like, once the first one goes up in New York City, people know immediately that it's meant to connote liberty and that it is somewhat political. But yes, you're absolutely right. That is sort of where it begins. On your larger question of kind of power and the state monopolizing power, yeah, I definitely agree. This is sort of what's at issue here, particularly for the Federalists. And there's a way in which my work, especially as it kind of moves into the 19th century, is thinking about how the state is trying to deal with democracy, right, as it's happening on the ground, and the ways in which those in power try to use institutional politics to kind of tamp down these extra institutional politics. So the ways in which elections and the expansion of the suffrage and the growth of political parties, especially as political parties become, first of all, more accepted, but also they take on a lot of these kind of popular elements with raising liberty poles, for instance, but log cabins, parades, all that kind of thing. That's kind of a head fake. That's a way to sort of let people believe that they have a bigger say in government than they actually do, right? That you're more satisfied now because you have the vote, as opposed to trying to participate in politics in all these other ways that were happening before. I hope that gets at part of what you were asking.
Yeah, and I mean, federalism adds a kind of really fascinating wrinkle in this, because when we're talking about the state in this context, like the state of South Carolina is, contesting its rights and its powers with the federal government. So, that is very much what's at issue, the limits and the balance of that dynamic. In South Carolina, everyone is, even the Unionists are defending states' rights. They just think that one of those rights is, nullification is not among those rights. So there's an interesting kind of conversation that's going on. They're sort of working this out, and they don't, as Dr. Nicoletti said, they don't really come to a resolution about what the balance of that is in the crisis. And that's something that the people themselves are contesting, as again, as nullifiers are raising this state army of 25,000 people. Unionists are raising these kind of paramilitary organizations, these very kind of decentralized, bottom-up organizations to contest the right of the state's monopoly on power.
I had a question that's sort of a bit more specific to Brian's paper, and it occurred to me that just South Carolina has such a different political system than the rest of the country. I mean, I just was wondering sort of to what degree you see people really chafing against this sort of anti-democratic, really, there's no direct election of the president. How much that plays into the unique political culture of South Carolina, how much people are satisfied, for example, with just voting in certain elections, or just, and how much they're really aware of and I guess, chafing against this sort of their restrictions.
Yeah, great question. So as a bit of context, South Carolina has a really interesting kind of political history. It was one of the first states to grant universal white male suffrage, but as one historian said, all men could vote, but they had very little to vote for. South Carolina white men could vote for the General Assembly, the state legislature, and the House of Representatives members. Everything else was chosen by the legislature. The legislature chose its senators, but also the governor and state officials. So the people had very little to vote for. And this contributed to a very kind of aristocratic political culture. South Carolina's political elites had the sense that they were kind of destined to rule. They were part of these, families that had been around for 150 years, and there was this intense sense of kind of political social entitlement. Some Unionists buy into this. Some of them look at nullifiers as a kind of untamed wild mob that, they can look at nullifiers as rabble. But by and large, the paradigm that I've noticed is that a lot of Unionists chafe against this political system. A lot of Unionists, one of the guys that I talk about a lot is an editor named Benjamin Perry in Greenville in the Upcountry, who is trying to democratize the state. And in fact, so in order to nullify the tariff, nullifiers have to call for a state convention. And Unionists see this as a real opportunity. They say, well, look, a state convention can change the state constitution. That means that we have the power to change our political system and to reapportion the legislature to make things a little more equal. The map is no longer here, but what the map would have shown you is that there are a lot of really, really big districts in the upcountry toward the mountains and a lot of really small districts in the low country close to Charleston. What that means is, I think the math is that 80 people who live outside of Charleston have the same amount of power in the legislature as 3,000 people who live in the mountains, because it's so disproportionate. The legislature is so kind of misproportioned. So they want to fix that and to make more offices elective. So part of the Unionist effort is this sort of Jacksonian democratic sense of trying to empower the people. Now, of course, the people meaning white men. But yeah, that very much is at play during the crisis. Yeah.
So I have a question for each one of you. So I was wondering, Shira, you talked about sedition law and then you talked about sedition polls, but I didn't hear anything about alien, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious if that wasn't part of the politics at all at the time for either party, because I thought maybe it was.
Yeah.
So if you could just tell me a little bit about that, that would be really interesting. And then, Brian, I was really taken by this notion of the Unionists embracing this cowardly and unmanly stance. And forgive me, but it just took me right back to the beginning of the morning with Olivia, right, about thinking about, well, if I understood you correctly, that the Constitution is in some ways protecting their liberty. And I just was wondering if you could say a little bit more about, because that's just so different than in many ways they made me think of Make America Great Again, right? So I was just curious about that element of their discourse.
Definitely. I can go. Yeah, absolutely. And that actually struck me during the earlier panels as well. Unionists, again, I can't emphasize enough how much they endorse slavery and patriarchy. Kind of, again, the number of people in number of white people in South Carolina that question that is basically 3 or 4. Most prominently, Sarah and Angelina Grimke, who go north and become really famous abolitionists. So the vast majority support slavery and patriarchy, and yeah, to sort of make a modern day parallel, I think the difference is Unionists think that the current political system, does protect these things, and the anxiety there is not so much kind of returning to a supposed halcyon past where things were better, but to kind of keep things the way that they already are. So I think the anxieties there are a little bit different, but I think the parallel is really, really insightful. And as far as this question of kind of embracing this idea of being a submission man, that's in itself really fascinating. And not all Unionists do it. Some Unionists, when nullifiers call them submission men, they pull out their cane and just beat the person. But what's interesting is a lot of them embrace this thing and say, well, part of what it means to be a man is to submit to law and order and the Constitution, because the Constitution is what makes civilization possible. So, the law is what protects our rights as men, our the privileges of patriarchy and slave owning and those kinds of things. And so it's kind of paradoxical. They embrace the mantle of submission to the law because that gives them all the other rights of manhood, the rights of manhood that they need to have. So yeah, it's really complicated and messy, but the gender politics is fascinating.
Yes, so Republicans do raise liberty poles to protest the alien laws. Usually kind of as a package deal with the alien and sedition laws, but for a variety of reasons, one of which is that immigrants vote Republican, but also because Republicans see the alien sedition laws as this package deal in which the Federalists are just trying to amass more power and hold on to the power that they have. So this is all sort of part of the sort of language that I talked about, right? That in addition to these regressive taxes, the Federalists are just trying to amass more power for themselves, disenfranchise certain types of people, deport certain types of people, although that doesn't actually happen. And so it's less about certain Republicans being open-minded and less xenophobic than others, and more, I think, about political power and yeah.
Thanks for filling that in.
No problem.
Somebody else. I have a question about liberty polls. And I mean, I'm not sure how helpful this would be, but I was really curious about the symbolism of liberty polls, like other people have been, and what the symbolism of those liberty polls might say about how people at this time were conceptualizing democratic sovereignty. I mean, like on the one hand, it sounds like are they attaching the symbolism of liberty to the poll or the poll raising itself? I mean, is it that this is a symbol of a particular kind of stance, regardless of the enfranchisement or lack thereof of those who had raised it, or is the raising the thing that's democratic or liberty endowing? A lot of people getting together and and also the liberty poll sort of struck me as I mean, as sort of indicative of a number of things. It's like a flag pole, but doesn't have a flag, I don't think. So it's kind of like a signifier you can attach all kinds of things to. I don't know why it's a pole instead of a sign. And it made me think of like the frontispiece to Hobbes' Leviathan. He has a staff that kind of looks a little bit like the Liberty Pole. I don't know. I was very curious about this. And then also it's very minor, but I think politics is great.
I've milked all the puns today. There's no pun I haven't tried. But what interesting questions you just raised. I think so. On the idea of kind of like where is the liberty and what makes it democratic, I think it's sort of like all the way through. So yes, the act of raising a liberty pole, as I mentioned, democratic and empowering for especially people who don't have the vote. Liberty polls then mark space, right, in important ways, as I talked about. They're also used as meeting points after they're raised. So particularly on the 4th of July, people will go there and Republicans will read the Declaration of Independence, for instance, and they'll toast Thomas Jefferson and that kind of thing. Which is why Federalists want to take them down, right? And I should mention that sometimes Federalists aren't content with just toppling them, they completely destroy them. So they'll burn them and scatter the ashes, or they'll chop them into pieces and bury them in the ground, which really I think is telling about the ways in which Federalists are trying to reclaim public space. But we can imagine in the ways in which, were some of the monuments in Charlottesville to be taken down, right, the memory of that space marker will remain even after it's gone. So I think in all of those ways, the kind of meanings of liberty and democracy are tied up in what's happening.
Another random thought. So just, I mean, this is. I just wanted to make this more explicit, but I feel like it's been implicit in this discussion. But I'm just really fascinated by the way that both of your papers raise this question of, how constraining democracy is and how constraining the Constitution is, right?
Yeah.
So. I would not have thought about this, right? But the idea that, well, now that we have the people's voice, right, that's a channel, right? And anything that's outside that channel is now illegitimate in a way that it wouldn't have been, right? So it makes actually, anything that's outside of, the one realm, something that wouldn't have, that is now illegitimate by definition.
Right. Yeah.
round of applause.